vast majority of people who dine out, especially indoors, don't want to see us go back to how things were, where we had either no opportunity to serve people indoors, or last September, for the first time, we could serve 25% capacity. That is so yesterday. We know right now that the vaccine works, and it's time to make sure that this economy continues to move forward.
Hello, and welcome to Washington Post Live. My name is Laura Riley, and I'm the Business of Food reporter here at the Post. Please, thanks for joining us for this ongoing series, The Path Forward. Today we'll be discussing the restaurant industry. And to give their perspective on the ways in which the industry has changed over the course of the pandemic, we have restaurateurs Danny Meyer and Nina Compton. Thank you both for joining us today.
Good morning.
Good morning. So, Danny, I'd like to start with you. You made a lot of waves several weeks back when you said you were going to ask for vaccination proof from staff and customers. And since then, a lot of other restaurant groups have joined that position. And now we have all of New York City restaurants that will have to require proof of vaccination by September 13th. I'd like to get your thoughts on why you kind of were an early adopter of that position, what drove you to that, and how that's played out for you personally in your restaurants.
I think that New York was an early adopter of COVID, unfortunately, and we had so many really tough experiences in the city with having to lay people off, close restaurants, take forever to get reopened. And as we stumbled our way back into business in 2020, it was almost always based on things like trying to take people's temperatures in order to allow them to dine outdoors, and or QR codes to get contact tracing. And there's just no question in my mind that the one thing that finally moved our economy forward and allowed us to begin to hire people back and to begin to open our doors to guests was when the vaccinations were starting to be much more available to people. And so it's very, very clear to me when you look at data, especially when the Delta variant started to sweep through the country, that people who were not vaccinated had a far, far greater level of infection and hospitalizations in some cases. And so it was clear to us that we did not want to go back, that getting this economy back on its feet was far, far more important than anything else. And so we said, let's do what we think is the right thing from a hygiene standpoint, both for our staff members and our guests. And so we took a stand on it.
So I misspoke before, so I guess the mandate begins today. So Danny, how is it that you're going to enforce this? What are the kind of protocols or training sessions that you need to do with staff to make this work seamlessly and not really put them in the kind of the role of the police in this very acrimonious situation?
Yeah, well, that's actually a great point. That's the last thing we want to do. It's actually quite helpful that this is now a citywide mandate. So we're not asking our staff members to do anything that restaurant goers throughout New York City won't be experiencing wherever they go to dine. But keep in mind, this is a two-sided requirement that we're asking. We are asking our staff members themselves to prove that they've been vaccinated, and we're asking our guests to prove that they've been vaccinated. We didn't think we could ask one constituency and not the other. How would it feel if you were a staff member if we didn't require this of our guests? And at the same time, how would you feel if you were a guest understanding that we didn't require it of our staff members? So from a staff standpoint, it's the same type of credentialing that we ask for so many other aspects before we hire you. And there's been a lot of information gathering, a lot of counseling, and we've had a pretty good success at converting some, not all people. I'm sad to say we probably will lose some staff members, but they won't be going to other New York City restaurants because it's now the law throughout New York City. We do have some concern that we may lose some hospitality employees to, say, retail, because unfortunately the mandate in New York City does not apply to all different business sectors. It's entertainment gyms, and restaurants. So we'll see what happens there. With respect to our guests, we're going to do the exact same protocol that we did for months when we were taking everybody's temperature, asking everybody to provide information so we could do contact tracing. Only this time it's going to be a matter of please show us your smartphone, where many people have their proof of vaccination digitally stored. And for those who don't, they have a CDC card with a proof of vaccination. And it's a pretty straightforward thing. I've already experienced this as a guest in other people's restaurants. And I think people who have been vaccinated are all too happy to know that they're going to be surrounded by and served by people who have been vaccinated.
So Nina, your two restaurants are in New Orleans, a city that has seen a big surge in terms of the Delta variant infection rate, and also that will soon be implementing a vaccine mandate for dining out. How have you dealt with this, and how much pushback has there been, and what's the consensus in the restaurant community about this being the path forward?
Well, New Orleans, from the beginning of the pandemic, we were a hotspot last March, and the mayor did a really good job of keeping the cases down and controlling events and everything else. And vaccinations, we were actually trending #1 in the beginning of vaccination rollout. And then now we are trending actually backwards, with now being another hotspot with a lot of cases. So today they're rolling out the enforcement of the vaccine mandate for restaurants, and also just any event that you go to, you have to, a music venue, you have to present your vaccine card. So I think that is something that's going to really help us move forward, because we were stabilized as an industry, I think, the past couple of months, and then now there's a lot of uncertainty. But I think with the vaccination requirement, it's going to get us back on track and get us, where we need to be as a society, to the new normal of that being the past, and now living a safe, comfortable life and be able to go out and, dine safely or go to an event venue safely.
So Nina, I think the first time we spoke was right when the Independent Restaurant Coalition came together, and you were kind of a strong voice in that early on. I'd love for you to back up a little bit and talk about how the various tranches of relief, the PPP and the Restaurant Relief Fund, have been insufficient in making restaurants whole, or even kind of close to whole over this. How was the PPP not designed specifically for restaurants? I mean, for a lay viewership here, they may not understand how that kind of one-size-fits-all approach didn't work for your industry.
Of course. So a lot of when the pandemic hit, restaurants were forced to shut down. Some were doing takeout, some were dining out only. And that was a very tough thing for us to pivot, because we always felt we were one step behind with this virus, because we were trying to operate our businesses safely. And every time that we tried to do something, it was not quick enough. And a lot of people end up closing their restaurants just to figure stuff out, because this is a very deadly virus and we wanted to make sure we were operating safely. So we closed both our restaurants until we felt that we had enough information to operate safely. And during that time, we had to furlough most of our staff and try and figure out how we can do this again, is to reopen safely, get everybody back employed. And at that time, the government wasn't giving any relief to our industry. And when they finally, heard our voices, they rolled out the PPP, which was at that time a quick band-aid, because the rules that they had in place were, we'll give you the funding, you have 8 weeks to spend it, which is not really ideal for anybody, because then after 8 weeks, you have to lay everybody off. I joined the RSC when they had just formed late March, early April. And we were just restaurateurs that were pulling our hair out, trying to understand, what are we going to do? How are we going to save this industry? It's 11 million people employed in the hospitality industry in this country. That's a lot of people that were left out in the cold, not understanding what's next. So we were having these meetings 3 times a week, trying to understand, how can we save this industry? So we went to Congress and we said the verbiage and the restrictions for the PPP needs to be extended for a longer time, so we can spend those funds wisely and keep the restaurant going. Of course, that wasn't long enough. That wasn't enough funds for people to stay open. A lot of people that money ran out very quickly. So we went to them again and said, we need the restaurant relief fund to help us get back on track, because a lot of people don't understand restaurants are expensive to run and you're dealing with a lot of staff. So there's a lot of things that you have to remember, that to keep the restaurant going, you need a lot of cash flow. And those are the things we were trying to get from the government, was to get the funding so we can keep those restaurants going for a longer period of time. Unfortunately, of course, the fund was exhausted very quickly because a lot of restaurants applied for those things. Some were larger, some were smaller. And unfortunately, a lot of venues that were
Nina, can you hear us? Danny, while we're waiting to get Nina back, let's see. Oh, she's sorry. You cut out for just a moment. So
can you hear me?
What you just said. Yes,
I'm
I
sorry.
hear you now.
So a lot of the funds were exhausted very quickly because some of those venues that applied were not restaurants, and they received the funds.
All right, Danny, I think I'd like to switch gears while we make sure that we get her connection squared away. Both of you have been extremely, a restaurant is or especially a restaurant group, has a million moving parts, and this has been an incredibly trying time. Why have you kind of chosen to take this leadership role right now in pointing out the unique challenges to the restaurant industry?
First of all, Nina's back, so if she wants to finish her thought, I'd be eager to hear it, because I'm really grateful for her leadership. I promise I'll answer your question, but.
Great. So Nina, go ahead and go back to, you were talking about the Restaurant Relief Fund, and then it cut out briefly. So if you can revisit that.
So in a nutshell, the Restaurant Relief Fund was exhausted quite quickly, because a lot of restaurants are in need and a lot of people did not receive the funding. So
I heard
we are
about
trying to get back on track.
So about a third of applicants received funding?
Correct. A third of them received funding. And what we're trying to do is get that replenished.
Great.
So I'm going to step
and we really need the help to keep restaurants alive.
Right. All right, so Danny, if you want to answer that question.
I just want to add to that, because I think that the restaurant relief program had some really good aspects to it. And as Nina was just saying, unfortunately, the funding ran out after about a third of applicants had received their funding, which means 2/3 of restaurants were out in the cold. Very briefly, here's what it did. It compared unlike the PPP, which was a loan program that would either be forgivable or not if you were able to spend the funds, which, as Nina was saying, was where a lot of the problem was. The Restaurant Relief Fund would compare your 2019 receipts to your 2020 receipts, and would actually make a grant to the business if you received the funding of the delta between 2020 and 2019. And it was a wonderful thing for those who got it, a horrible thing for those who did not, in ways that people did not foresee. So a lot of us think that what the government should have done would either be fund the whole thing, but if they couldn't have funded the whole thing, wouldn't it have been better to give everybody a third of what they would have requested, as opposed to a third of the people 100% and 2/3 of the people 0%? Because now, unfortunately, we've got a really bad dynamic set up where our industry, which has come together so beautifully, so many different restaurants, so many employees that have been left out in the cold, and now it's pitting restaurant against restaurant, because against the backdrop of a labor shortage that you've all heard about and read about, imagine that 1/3 of the restaurants now have enough funding to be paying dramatically higher wages, sometimes taking talent from the restaurants that didn't get the funding. And so we are absolutely urging Congress to pass a bill, which is now sitting on the floor, which is the Replenishment Act, so that the 2/3 of restaurants that were left out in the cold can achieve that funding, and we can get this economy to keep moving forward.
So you raise an excellent point, the staffing issue. And I've talked to a lot of people in the industry who've said, This isn't a staffing crisis, this is a wage crisis. That's been the problem, that this has been an industry issue for years, and obviously there have been many approaches to solving the problem of things like the disparity in income between the back of the house and the front of the house in a restaurant, those kinds of things. I'd love to hear each of your thoughts on the idea that this is calling attention to low wages or very disparate wages in the industry. And is this a moment to reset, and what can be done? So Nina, maybe start with you.
I do agree there is, I have been in this industry for quite some time, and you look at the highest paid, minimum wage needs to go up. I think the wages do need to go up. And I think that over the past year, we've had a lot of people just stop and think and say, I deserve more, which they rightfully do. As an owner, it's not that easy. So what we did at both of our restaurants, actually, we added a kitchen appreciation service charge that actually the guests can leave extra, and each guest check, the kitchen gets a percentage of that. It's also very tricky, as Danny Meyer has done, and I applaud him for when he did the no tipping, because that is something that has been generational, and there is such a divide between the back of the house and the front of the house. So this is a way of bridging that gap, in the sense of the kitchen gets their own gratuity, not interfering with the front of the house, if that makes sense.
So Danny, I would like to hear your thoughts on your no tipping experiment, and was that a disappointment to you, or how are you thinking about that now? And also, I'd like to hear your thoughts on kind of wages, kind of writ large in the industry.
Well, I think that this moment is a necessary resetting in our industry, and I think that a lot of the wage hikes that have necessarily happened for restaurants to be able to open their doors is going to stick. Anybody who could work remotely during COVID lost a lot fewer jobs than the kind of businesses, not just restaurants, but any business that you had to do in person during COVID, especially pre-vaccine, are experiencing severe labor shortages right now, whether it's drivers, truck drivers, delivery drivers, performing artists, anybody who is in the service industry who could not work during COVID had a whole lot of time to think about whether or not this is a career they wanted to come back to or not. And with everybody trying to hire at the exact same time, there's a traffic jam, and money and wages are part of what is solving that. And I think a lot of that is going to stick, and that's a good thing. Our 5-year experiment with eliminating tipping was based on one thing. We have a lot of laws in this country, sadly, state by state laws. It's not a federal law that prohibit tips to be shared between people who work in the dining room and people who cook the food. And it just was always evident to me, two things. One, you don't work any less hard because you cooked the pasta as opposed to bringing the pasta to someone's table. And number two is that year after year, every time menu prices go up, tips go up, because a tip is a multiplier of your menu price. And that's a good thing for tipped employees, but it was not a good thing for people laboring in the kitchen who were not seeing the same type of annual compensation raise. So what we tried to do for 5 years was to narrow that wage disparity, which was especially concerning because we also have statistics that show that the number of people with color who work in the back of the house where tips are not able to be shared is greater, and the people who are white who work in the front of the house is greater than the number of people with color. So as an industry, I think this past year and a half has given us an opportunity to see both of those things, take a look. We have reinstituted tipping because I came to the conclusion that it was wrong-headed of me to prevent guests who wanted to say thank you to staff members who were putting themselves on the line, especially during dangerous times of COVID, prohibit them from being able to say thank you with a tip. And it was also wrong-headed of me to prohibit our staff members from accepting that gratitude. So what we did, similar to what you just heard from Nina, was that in reinstituting tipping, we also began for the first time to pay a share of our revenue on a nightly basis to the people in our kitchen who are not eligible to receive tips. We don't have a line on our guest check because unfortunately in New York State, that's still not legal for some crazy reason. What we would love to see our state do, since this is a state rule, is to provide for tips to be shared so that when you come to a restaurant and you want to say thank you, you know that your tips are not only being shared between the people who brought the food to your table, but are being shared amongst everybody.
So you brought up a couple things in that last answer that I'd like to kind of touch back on. I think that the restaurant industry was hit really hard by #MeToo issues, kind of starting a few years ago, and then Black Lives Matter happened, and now into a pandemic. So we've had a series of real seismic shifts that have, in some ways, perhaps. I mean, it's an industry that hasn't historically had great human resources apparatus or a lot of the kind of built-in infrastructure of other industries. So for both of you, is this a moment where some good can come in terms of reconceptualizing equity issues or those kinds of things? And Nina, I'd love to start with you.
Sure. Like you said, last year was a year of bringing us to our knees and really looking at things and reevaluating not just our lives, but our business structure. I think a lot of things, did come up negatively, but I think in a positive way, it made us really stop and think about how this industry, has so many faults, and we need to think about that. I remember I was on it was a Zoom call I was on with somebody, and they were talking about this industry needs to break and then reform. And I think now we're in reforming the industry in a beautiful time. As negative as things may seem, I think this is the time to rebuild and pluck out the things that don't make sense, and to pluck out the things that need to make sense, and really focus on, equity, to talk about race, to talk about harassment. A lot of people don't have an HR department in their restaurants. So a lot of those things it's brought to the forefront, and we have to really focus on those things, on how we treat our staff, how we treat our guests equally, and make it as that's really important. It's one of those things that the restaurant industry is so fast paced. We're constantly moving. The dining room is full, the ticket machine is rolling, and we never really stopped and said, okay, how do we make this industry better? How do we make our place better? And those are the things that we have to really focus on, is those issues that are indifferent and making it a better place, and facing them head on is really important now, because that is the only way we can move forward. Because we talk about, toxic workplaces, an angry kitchen, those things we stop before we actually speak now. And I think that's really important, where people say, I'm going to think about what I'm going to say before I actually say it. And we're at this time right now.
So Danny, you have a much larger ship to reorient, but what kinds of things have you instituted or have you ditched even in order to kind of meet this series of challenges that we've just talked about?
Well, first of all, I fully agree with Nina. This is an amazing industry, and let's just not forget what we do. We're in the business of making people feel better. We're not sending people to the moon, and we're not curing cancer. We are hopefully a business that is about hospitality, which is about giving you a couple hours in your day or your life that take care of you, and they're on your side. And if you think about it, if you have a toxic workplace and the food is not being prepared with love, and people are not feeling included who work at the restaurant, how in the world can we possibly achieve our greater mission of hospitality? And a lot of what's been going on in this industry, even when you have a really positive culture, which I believe we've had for years, you learn when you peel back the onion layers, it could be a whole lot better. And there have been people who have been left out and not included, and perhaps not nearly as diverse of a workforce as we need going forward. And so what we've done is to take a really hard look at ourselves. We have hired outside advisors to help hold up the mirror to us and show us where we can do a lot better. And it's truly about doing a much, much better job of, I think, listening and measuring and asking yourselves, where do you want to be? And then holding yourselves accountable for getting there. So one of the things we've done for the first time this year is to actually publish on our Union Square Hospitality Group website all of our diversity statistics, as well as what our goals are. And so on a quarterly basis, we can let anyone know who either wants to work in our company or might say this would be a reason I would choose to dine with that group. And let me see what they say that they want to do, and let's see how they're doing. And that's something we just never thought of before. But I've always believed that when you measure something that matters to you, it'll get better. It's something that somebody told me pretty soon after the George Floyd murder, and we were looking at the diversity statistics in terms of the both the gender and racial makeup of our company. Was, yeah, we need to do a lot better there, but that's only a start, because they said, think about it. If you were throwing a party and you invited more people that created a more diverse population, but you ignored them during the party and didn't make people feel welcome during the party, that's almost worse than if you had not invited them in the first place. And so we're truly taking a look at every aspect of it.
That was wonderful. I think we're going to have to leave it there. We're out of time. Danny and Nina, thank you both so much for sharing your morning with us today. And as always, my name is Laura Riley. I'm with the Post. And thanks for joining us. To check out what interviews we have coming up, please head to WashingtonPostLive.com to register and find out more of our upcoming events. Thanks.